Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And before I jump right into my remarks on C19, I want to take this opportunity on the floor of the House to recognize that it is International Women's Day, and also to note that we're debating two different bills. Bill C19 right now, which is about pandemic elections, and the government plans to call Bill C24 in the afternoon, which is about dealing with the economic consequences of the pandemic. And of course, we know that the pandemic has had a disproportionate influence on women in Canada, particularly the economic impact, because it's been workers who are in the caring economy and workers who tend to work in low-wage jobs that have seen a real disproportionate impact on their finances. And so I think it's important not only to recognize the general importance of International Women's Day, but to recognize it's important for the content of the debates that we're having today in the House. So with that, I'd like to speak to C19. I'm very glad that it has finally made it to the floor of the House of Commons. As far back as last June, this was an issue that I had reached out as the NDP's Democratic Reform critic to the other parties on to try and get a conversation started. And unfortunately, that didn't happen over last summer, but it did begin finally in the fall at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. For Canadians who are interested in this issue, I think both reports by the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, as well as the testimony that's on the record there, would be a benefit to try and get a better handle on some of the issues that are at play and some of the very real challenges that Canadians and the country would face in the event of a pandemic election. It's why the NDP has worked hard in this Parliament to make Parliament work and to try and find and broker compromises that allow us to respond to the needs of people here in Canada, to get us through the pandemic, and to make sure that partisan politics isn't distracting us from that very important task, Madam Speaker. When it comes to the bill itself, I'll say that I think it's important, and we've heard this consistently at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, that there be some more flexibility than that which our current system already allows, and in a few different ways, in order to make sure that as things progress, if we have a pandemic election, and I think we've heard from many different sides of the House today that, of course, the best way to protect both public health and our democracy during this pandemic is to avoid having an election. We know that takes effort on all sides of the House, but principally we need a government that is willing to work in good faith with the other parties in order to define its path forward and to define its pandemic response. We've seen the government do this at various times during the pandemic so far. We've been able to find that path forward, and I think as long as that spirit of collaboration persists on the government benches, we'll be able to continue to find that path forward until it's rightly and properly safe to have an election and let Canadians decide what they liked and what they didn't, and whose interventions they appreciated and whose they didn't, and what they want in terms of a government as we come out of the pandemic and get on with the recovery in earnest. So what are some of the things that this bill does? Well, it does grant an additional adaptation power to the Chief Elections Officer, which we think is a good thing. There's clearly going to be a need to be able to adapt some things on the fly, as it were, and in response to emerging conditions. And so we think it makes sense that because the Chief Elections Officer already has powers to adapt the Act, that we would add public health as a consideration explicitly, that the Chief Elections Officer can take into account when exercising that power to adapt. There are some moves in the right direction in terms of long-term care and trying to clear some of the legislative roadblocks to conducting a vote safely in long-term care. I'm not sure that it addresses all of the issues that are there, but certainly being able to have one polling station per institution, which the legislation currently doesn't allow for, is an important change and will provide flexibility to Elections Canada in order to make sure that legislative requirements don't cause Elections Canada either to have to have the same people moving from institution to institution, which clearly is not a good idea during the pandemic, and in many cases not consistent with local public health orders. Or just as bad or worse from the point of view of democracy, cancel having a polling station in a long-term care facility for lack of being able to do it at one facility only. And I think one of the important themes to bear in mind for members as we have the debate about this legislation, and for Canadians as they consider this larger point about a pandemic election, is that our job is twofold. It's not only to protect public health, although it is obviously also that, and very importantly that, it is to protect democracy as well. And I think if we have an election during the pandemic that succeeds in protecting public health at the expense of not having people vote, either because people's perceptions and fears about their personal health meant that they make a choice not to participate, or because people who would choose to participate face insurmountable barriers to participation, we will have failed, because it's not enough simply to protect public health. We also have to protect our democracy, and that is a difficult thing to do. And I think it's one of the reasons why it's better if we do it in a preventative way by working well at the job we were elected to do, which is to defend the interests of Canadians and prevent the triggering of an election in any event. And of course, the NDP has asked many times in this House for the Prime Minister to commit to not unilaterally calling an election, which is now consistent with the recommendation in the final report of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. We haven't got that commitment yet. I think that would go a long way to reassuring Canadians that we're not going to find ourselves in the unfortunate situation of a pandemic election. So there's some other things that the Act does. I know my time is limited today, Madam Chair, even more so than usual, given some of the proceedings of the House earlier today. I do want to speak a little bit to some of the challenges or some of the things that have yet to be addressed in the legislation. By way of challenge, I would just note, and the minister noted this in his lead speech on the bill, that these provisions are only set to come into force 90 days after this bill gets royal assent. So in other words, after it passes through the House and then the Senate and then gets the final nod from the Governor General. And I think that's important to bear in mind as well when we're addressing the general theme of a pandemic election, because even if the legislation were to completely pass and get royal assent today, which of course is not going to happen, we would still be in the position of having to wait another 90 days before an election would be held under these new rules as opposed to the existing ones. And I think that's important to mention, although I appreciate it will take time for Elections Canada to bring these new measures into force. I think it's important on the general point of getting some better reassurances from the Prime Minister and the government about whether we have an election or not, because for as much as some people in the House will like certain things about this bill, it's not, even if we were to pass it today, it wouldn't be in effect for some time. So there's clearly a need to be working in that spirit of collaboration for some time to come in order to be able to avoid an election on the existing set of rules, which I think are not adequate to the circumstances. I also know that there's been a lot of talk about, whether we should accept postmark ballots by Election Day, whether the cutoff should be Election Day for mail-in ballots, whether the cutoff should be the Tuesday after the Election Day as this legislation foresees. The thing that I want to put on the record about this, Madam Speaker, because I think there is more than one way to solve this problem. I think the best way will be the way where we can find as much agreement as possible. I beseech members in all parties to keep an open mind about this, because it is a very difficult circumstance. I do think that having a hard cutoff for when ballots are accepted that corresponds to Election Day really does put us in the risky situation of having people who applied in good faith for a ballot and didn't get it in a timely way and did as much as they could in order to ensure that it would get to Elections Canada, recognizing, of course, that as much as you can is different for different people. It matters whether you have your own vehicle. It matters whether you're able to drive or not. It matters whether or not you have somebody in your support network that can get you to one of the designated drop boxes outside of a returning office. It matters how easy it is to get to the local mailbox, which can vary depending on the weather. There are all sorts of things that come into play. It's not like a normal election. And I would want us to ensure that there is the possibility that people who applied for a special ballot but don't get it in time, or for other reasons aren't able to get it in the mail in time or in the drop box in time, are not deprived of their right to vote. Exactly because I think we have a double duty here, both to public health and to democracy. And I think it would be tragic if a number of Canadians were not able to exercise their right to vote because of administrative complications and deadlines that are beyond their control. And I do think it will be harder to meet the normal deadlines of an election in the ways that we're used to if we have a pandemic election. So I would just call for some open-mindedness on that, Madam Chair, as we go forward. I'm sure it will be the subject of some debate at committee when the bill finally gets there, as I'm confident it will. And so that discussion is not over. And I think it's just important that we perhaps could at least agree on some of the guiding principles for that conversation before partisan lines get drawn too starkly in the sand, Madam Speaker. I do think that there are a number of things that aren't addressed in the bill that ought to be. So for instance, it came up in debate earlier, but the question of how we collect nomination signatures, everyone in this House will know you need 100 signatures from people who live in the riding in order to be officially nominated as a candidate with Elections Canada. Usually that's done by going door to door with sheets of paper and pens. That's not going to make a lot of sense in the context of a pandemic election. So we need another way to do that that's appropriate and safe. This bill does allow for people to apply for a special ballot online. And while I think that's a great thing and a great tool, and is going to be wonderful for the people who are able to avail themselves of that because they have the technological literacy and because they have the equipment in their own home, we're very mindful that there are a lot of people for whom that technology is not accessible. And those people are going to need to be able to apply in person without having to print the documents at home and all of that. And we recognize in the NDP that we have an incredibly valuable resource at our fingertips, which is Canada Post, that has a number of postal outlets in every community across the country already, with people who check ID already for other reasons, and I think is well equipped to be a space for those who need it to be able to go and apply for a special ballot in person. And so we encourage the government and Elections Canada to look very seriously at leveraging that network to ensure that people can access their right to vote if the time comes that they're required to do so. Whether that's best done in legislation or not is a question that we're open to discussing, but I think seeing a commitment to that is important in recognition of all the people for whom online simply isn't the best tool. We've talked a little bit about the Campus Vote program, and there's obviously some different opinions about whether that ought to continue or not, but we heard from representatives of students at committee very clearly there continue to be students living and working on campuses, and we can increase access to the vote if we maintain that important program. It ought to be done. I think one of the other things that we need to see, I'm sure Elections Canada will be addressing in its own way, but we should know if there's anything legislatively required in order to do that in the best way before we approve the bill, is the question of scrutineering in long-term care facilities. Because as much as we've talked a bit about how to staff it, there's still the question of having scrutineers come in. So those are my initial thoughts. I see the Speaker is anxious to get on with the orders of the day, and I thank you very much for his grace in allowing me to conclude. Thank you very much.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona for cutting it short, but he will have another 6 minutes coming to him when we return, and he can start and continue and finish his argument.